My daughter-in-law took me to court. She filed a petition to have me declared mentally incompetent. That's the word they use. Incompetent. She wants a judge to sign one piece of paper, just one that says I can't be trusted to manage my own affairs anymore. My money, my house, my own life. And she wants that judge to hand every last bit of it over to her. She thinks she is about to take everything I own. But stay with me a minute, because she doesn't know what you're about to know. She has no idea that I spent the last 40 years quietly building the very trap she just walked into. My name is Annie Ruth Coleman. I am 66 years old. And when this is all over, folks are going to say I got lucky. I didn't get lucky. I got ready. Because I have spent my whole life watching people decide what an old black woman is and is not capable of. And I learned a long time ago to let them go right on believing it. It came on a Tuesday. A stiff cream envelope with the county seal in the corner sitting in my mailbox between a water bill and the church newsletter. Like deciding whether a woman gets to keep her own life was just one more errand for somebody's afternoon. I carried it to my kitchen table. I sat down in the chair I've sat in for 31 years. And I read it twice. I read everything twice, and before this is over, I'm going to tell you why. The word incompetent was on that first page 4 times. I counted. The way you'd count the seeds in a bad apple, just to know what you're dealing with. Then I got up and I put the kettle on. I want you to notice that. Not the tears, not the phone, the kettle, because my hands did not shake. Not one bit. I stood at my own stove and watched that steam curl up, and I felt something settle down inside me that I hadn't felt in years. Something cold, something clear, something almost like relief. See, for 8 years, ever since my husband Samuel passed, I had been playing a part. The sweet old widow, fading, harmless as a house cat. And that letter sitting on my table, that was the whole reason I had never once taken the costume off. Let me tell you something. I have been underestimated by far better people than Vanessa. Bankers who looked straight past me to shake my husband's hand. Lawyers who slowed their words way down when they talked to me like old age was some foreign country. And a man in a fine suit, a long, long time ago, who stood in my mother's front yard and took 40 acres right out from under a family that couldn't read what he put in front of them. I poured my tea. I sat back down. And I said the only thing worth saying out loud to the empty kitchen, to that county seal, to the whole quiet house. They picked the wrong old woman. Now let me show you exactly how they found that out. Let me tell you how the world sees me. It will matter later. The world sees me on Sunday afternoons at the head of a table I have set for other people my entire adult life. That particular Sunday, 3 weeks before the letter, though I didn't know the letter was coming yet, I had the good cloth down and the roast in, and my son and his wife came through the door, the way they always did now, Vanessa first already talking, and Darius a half step behind her, already tired. "Mama Annie," Vanessa called out in that bright, careful voice people use on children and the very old. She kissed the air beside my cheek. She smelled like a department store counter. "You didn't go up on that step stool again, did you? We talked about this. Just to reach the platter, baby. See, that's exactly what I mean." She turned to Darius, not to me, and this is the thing I want you to catch, so I'm going to slow it down. She turned to him to talk about me with me standing right there, close enough to touch. This is what I worry about. She's up on a stool by herself with nobody home. One fall, Darius. One fall and it's a hip, and then it's a whole different conversation. "Mama, you got to be careful," Darius said. He said it to the floor. "My son is 41 years old. He has his father's long hands and his father's habit of looking at his shoes when he's ashamed of something and hasn't figured out yet that he's ashamed." I had noticed over those last months that he could no longer hold my eye across a room. I filed it away. I filed a great many things away that year in the same quiet drawer where I keep everything I'm not ready to use. We sat down to eat, or rather they sat down and had a conversation about me across the pot roast while I passed the potatoes. The thing is, Vanessa was saying a house this size at her age, the upkeep alone, the taxes, it's a lot to keep straight. She had a way of saying a lot to keep straight that made your own mind feel like a junk drawer. I've been helping her with the mail, just so nothing slips. Just so nothing slips. I had watched her over those months learn the geography of my paperwork the way a burglar learns a floor plan. Which drawer held the deeds? Which folder held the accounts? She helped me the way water helps a foundation patiently and from underneath. There's a doctor I found, she went on, buttering a roll for my son as though he'd lost the use of his arms. Real good with seniors. Memory cognition, all that. I already made you an appointment, Mama Annie. Thursday after next. I'll drive you myself. That's thoughtful, dear, I said. And here is where I want you to understand what I was doing, because if you don't, you'll think I was a fool, and I have never in my life been a fool. When she slid the appointment card across the table, I picked it up and turned it the wrong way and squinted at it, and I said, Now which Thursday, baby, the one coming or the one after? And I watched a small, satisfied light come on behind Vanessa's eyes. The light of a woman whose story is being confirmed. I gave her that light on purpose. It cost me nothing, and it was worth everything, because a person who thinks you're slipping stops guarding what they say. That is a law of nature as sure as gravity. I have built the second half of my life on it. The one after, she said, gently patting my hand. I wrote it down for you. See? Well, aren't you good to me? Across the table, my granddaughter Simone was watching the whole performance with her jaw set. 19 years old, home from her first year of college, sharp as a tack, and twice as hard to fool. She caught my eye, really caught it the way Darius couldn't anymore, and I felt the toe of her sneaker press just once against my foot under the table. A small pressure. A private message that said I see it too. I pressed back and let it go. I did not know yet how much that child was about to risk for me. If I had, I'd have squeezed her hand until it hurt. Vanessa never once addressed a single word of business to me directly. Not the taxes, not the doctor, not the future. She spoke around me and over me and about me, and Darius stared at his plate. And the whole meal I sat at the head of my own table like a chair somebody had thrown a nice dress over. I'll tell you what they saw when they looked at me, if they looked at all. They saw a little old black woman in a historically black neighborhood the city had decided it wanted back. They saw a widow rattling around a paid-off house, minding 4 rental houses over on Delacroix Street that everybody assumed my husband had bought, and my son now ran. They saw somebody the rent came from, not somebody the rent went to. They saw the end of a story. What they never once considered, because the answer was standing right in front of them, pouring the sweet tea, was a simple question. If a woman with no head for business is so confused, so fading, so incompetent, then who kept those 4 houses on Delacroix rented for 30 years, at a price the mail carrier and the school aide and old Miss Ruth Ann could actually afford? Who paid every property tax bill in that neighborhood on time, while the whole rest of the block got bought up and boarded up and flipped? Who exactly do they think has been keeping all of this straight? They never asked. That was their first mistake, and it was the only one that mattered, because everything I did after everything you were about to watch me do was built on the space they left when they decided I wasn't worth a question. Nobody guards the door. They don't believe leads anywhere. That night after they'd gone, I did the dishes by hand the way I like to, and I dried each plate and set it in its place, and I turned off the kitchen light. Then I went to the front room and I took down a small framed thing I keep on the wall where most people hang a picture of the grandchildren. It isn't a picture. It's a piece of paper yellowed and soft at the folds under glass. I've had it framed for going on 50 years. I stood there in the dark, holding it the way you'd hold a hand, and I thought about my mother, and I thought about the man in the good suit, and I thought about the county seal sitting on my kitchen table waiting for me like it had all the time in the world. It didn't. None of them did. They just didn't know that yet. I hung the frame back on its nail, straightened it with one finger, and went up to bed and slept like a stone. It was 2 nights after that Sunday dinner that my granddaughter came to my door. It was past 11. I was up the way I am most nights now, sitting in the dark with the television off, when I heard a car ease to the curb with its lights already killed. Then soft feet on my porch, and a knock so quiet it was almost an apology. I opened the door, and there was Simone, 19 years old, hood up against a mist that wasn't really falling, holding a manila folder against her chest, like it was the only warm thing she owned. "Grandma," she said, "I have to show you something, and after I show you, you're going to wish I hadn't." I sat her down at the kitchen table and put the kettle on. You'll notice the kettle again. It is what my hands do when my mind needs room, and she slid the folder across to me. Inside were printed pages, still curled from a home printer. The first was a legal petition. My name across the top. Guardianship and conservatorship. Not filed yet. I could see it was a draft, the kind a lawyer sends back and forth, but real and nearly finished. The second was a doctor's evaluation. A physician I had never met in my life, described in 3 clinical pages, an examination that never happened. Tests I was never given. Questions I was never asked. Scores on paper for a mind that had been sitting quietly in the next room the whole time listening. At the bottom, a signature and a professional opinion that Annie Ruth Coleman was no longer capable of managing her own affairs. The third page was an email, and that was the one that told me this was bigger than a greedy girl and a sad old house. It was to a man named Grayson Pike. I didn't know the name then. I would come to know it very well. Vanessa had written him 3 short sentences, and the middle one is the one I've kept folded in my mind ever since. Once she's out of the picture, the whole Delacroix parcel comes with it. Give me 60 days. Out of the picture. That's what I was to them. A picture to be taken down off the wall. "Simone," I said, "where did you get these?" She told me. She'd been in the den, and Vanessa had left her laptop open and gone to answer the door, and Simone had seen her own grandmother's name on the screen and done what any child raised right would do. She'd looked. And then she'd printed it, hands shaking, and slid it under her shirt. "Grandma, if she finds out I did this..." Simone's voice cracked. "She pays my tuition. She could put me out of that house tonight. I don't have anywhere..." She stopped, started over. "But I couldn't just watch. I sat at that table Sunday and watched her talk about you like you were already gone, and you just sat there and let her, and I thought..." She shook her head. "I thought somebody in this family has got to still be paying attention. I have lived a long time. I have been given a great many things, some earned, some grieved for. But I am not sure anyone ever gave me anything finer than a 19-year-old girl sitting at my table at midnight, frightened out of her mind, choosing the hard right thing over the easy safe one. I did not cry. I want you to know that because it matters later. I reached across that table, and I held her face in both my hands, and I said, 'Baby, you listen to me. You're going to put every one of these pages back exactly where you found them. You're going to go home, and you're going to smile at that woman, and you are going to act like you don't know a single thing. Can you do that for me?' She stared at me. 'You're not Grandma they're trying to take everything. Why aren't you scared?' And I gave her the only answer I had. Because they're 40 years too late. After she left, I sat a long while. Then I got up and I took the frame down off the wall, the one that isn't a photograph, and I held it in my lap under the lamp, and I let myself go back to the place. I almost never let myself go. I was 8 years old. It was 1968. We had land then, 40 acres of it red dirt and a creek and a stand of pecan trees my grandfather had put in the ground with his own hands. It had come down through my mother's people, since not long after they'd stopped being able to be bought and sold themselves, and there was no deed to it the way the county liked deeds. It was what they call heirs property, owned by everybody in the family at once, and nobody in particular the way land gets held by people who were never once allowed to trust a courthouse. I remember the day the man came. He wore a gray suit in the July heat and never took the jacket off, and there was a second man with him carrying a leather case, and that second man was a lawyer, though I didn't have the word for it yet. They stood in our yard, and they were so polite. That's the part I've never forgotten. Nobody raised a voice. The man in the gray suit smiled the whole time and called my mother ma'am, and he laid papers out on the hood of his car, and he said there was a tax matter and a survey matter, and that he could make all of it go away, and all my mother had to do was sign. My mother, Ida Mae Coleman, was the strongest woman I have ever known. She could deliver a calf and preach a funeral and stretch a ham across 2 weeks of Sundays. And she stood there in her own yard, and she could not read the paper on that man's car. Neither could my father. Neither could a single grown person on our land that day. They looked at those words the way you'd look at deep water, and the man in the gray suit knew it. He had counted on it, and he stood there smiling and holding out his pen. She signed. What else was she going to do? She trusted his word because trusting was cheaper than the alternative. And the alternative was calling a man like that a liar to his face in Georgia in 1968. Inside a year, the 40 acres were his. The pecan trees, the creek, my grandfather's dirt. All of it gone into a gray suit, legal as Sunday, taken with a pen instead of a rope, because by then they'd learned a pen left less of a mark. I stood in that yard the day we left it 8 years old, and I made myself a promise. I did not fully understand it yet, but I have spent every year since keeping it. So let me tell you who I actually am, since apparently nobody in that courtroom is going to bother to ask. After we lost the land, I read. I read like it was food. I finished school when finishing school was not a thing girls like me were expected to do, and then I did the thing nobody expected at all. I went and got myself licensed. Real estate first. Then the harder things, titles, trusts, estates. The dry, coiled, powerful paperwork that quietly decides who keeps what in this country. In 1981, I became one of the first black women in the state to hold a broker's license and sit for the trust and estate work on top of it. I did not put it on a sign. I did not put it on the house. I have never once in my life needed you to know how smart I am. And then one lot at a time, I started buying back a neighborhood. Those 4 houses on Delacroix Street that everybody assumes my Samuel bought, I bought them. In 84, 86, 89, and 91 with money I earned and hid in plain sight. I bought them cheap when the city had written Millbrook off, and I have kept the rent on them low on purpose for 30 years, low enough for a mail carrier, a school aide, and old Miss Ruth Ann, who's 88, and has lived at 1412 since Eisenhower. I never took a dime more than the taxes and the roof required because I was never in it for the dime. I was in it so that what happened to my mother's 40 acres would never ever happen to these families. I held that neighborhood the way you hold a bird, firm enough that it can't be snatched, gentle enough that it can still breathe. Samuel, God rest him, was the face of it. The banks in those days wanted a man to shake hands with, so I gave them one, and he was a good one. And he knew exactly whose mind was running the whole thing and never once minded. You're the architect, Annie, he used to say. I'm just the front porch. When he passed, the world simply assumed the porch had held up the house. Let them. 2 people on this earth know the whole of it. The first is Beverly Cross, who my family thinks is my little friend from church, the quiet lady I sit with at second service. Beverly has been my attorney for 30 years and the co-trustee of everything I've built, and she is, I promise you, nobody's little friend from church. The second is Walter Grant, 72 years old, who has kept my papers in his box and my secrets in his chest since before Samuel and I were married. When you have spent a life being looked past, you learn to be careful about the 2 or 3 people you let actually see you. Now, here is the part I want you to hold on to because it is the whole trick, and Vanessa and her Mr. Pike never once looked hard enough to find it. If you go down to that county office and you pull the records on those Delacroix houses, you will find exactly one name, Coleman Legacy Holdings. A company. Tidy, ordinary sitting right there in the daylight. Vanessa found it. Pike found it. And they both looked at that company and thought the same simple thought a fox thinks looking at a hen house: control the old woman, control the company, control the land. That is the entire foundation their scheme is built on. Take Annie's mind on paper, take her signature, take the company, take it all. There is only one problem with it. And it is the kind of problem you build on purpose, 20 years ahead of time, when you have spent your whole life learning what a pen can do. Coleman Legacy Holdings doesn't own that land. It hasn't owned it for 20 years. I moved all of it, every brick on Delacroix, into something else a long time ago. Something structured so quiet and so deep that no routine search will ever bring it up. Something with a name I chose the way you choose a headstone. They can win every fight they think they're in. They can take the company down to the last paperclip. And at the end of it, they will be holding an empty box with a bow on it because the thing they came to steal was carried out of the building 2 decades before they ever thought to reach for it. They just don't know that yet. You know it now. They'll find out in a room full of people on a day of my choosing. I set the frame back on its nail and straightened it with one finger. Then I picked up the phone, even though it was near 1 in the morning, and I dialed the number I've known by heart for 30 years. Beverly answered on the second ring, wide awake the way she always is. "It started," I said. "I know," she said. "I've been waiting on your call. How long do we have?" I looked at the calendar on my kitchen wall. Somewhere across town, a draft was being finished. A seal was being readied. A girl was being told she was about to be worth a great deal of money. 60 days, I said. She asked the man for 60 days. I almost smiled. Let's not make her wait. Vanessa drove me to the doctor herself, just like she promised. She held my elbow across the parking lot as if the pavement might rise up and take me, and she talked the whole way in that soft, patient dentist office voice, and I let her. I have learned that the surest way to make a person believe you are helpless is to accept their help. The doctor's name was Reese. Dr. Alan Reese, a smooth man of about 50 with a firm handshake and a warm way of not quite looking at you. Now I have sat across from a great many professionals in my life. I know what a real examination feels like, the slow, careful, almost boring rhythm of a person actually trying to find something out. This was not that. Dr. Reese asked me the day of the week and the name of the president, and to remember 3 words he never came back and asked me for. He listened to my heart for the length of 1 breath. The whole thing took by the clock on his wall 11 minutes. And here is the part I filed away the way I file everything. Halfway through, he made a note about a test he said we'd just done, a clock drawing test, the kind where they hand you a pencil and a blank circle. He never handed me a pencil. There was no circle. There was no pencil in that room at all. But it would be in the report. I knew, sitting in that chair with my purse in my lap and my face arranged into pleasant confusion, that a document was going to be written about a woman who wasn't in that room, and that the woman who was in that room was going to remember every single thing that didn't happen. You cannot forge a thing in front of a person who reads everything twice and forget that she is a person. But they always do forget. That is the whole reason a gray suit ever wins. It wins right up until it doesn't. In the car after Vanessa squeezed my hand at a red light. "You did so good, Mama Annie," she said. "I know that's hard, all those questions." "He seems like a nice man," I said. "He's the best." She smiled at the windshield. "We're just making sure you're taken care of. That's all any of us want." I looked out my window at Millbrook, going by the corner store that used to be a corner store and was now a place that sold $10 coffee, the church. The bail bonds, the boarded houses with the developers' blue signs already staked in the yards, like little blue flags planted by an army that fights in daylight. Now, and I said, "I know it is, baby." And I meant something by it that she would not understand for another 58 days. The man himself came to my house on a Saturday. Vanessa called ahead, all breezy. She was bringing a friend who just loves old homes. Would I mind she'd bring the coffee cake? And an hour later, she came through my front door with Grayson Pike. I want to tell you exactly what it was like to shake that man's hand, because I have shaken it before. Not his, but his. He was younger than the gray suit had been, and his suit was blue and beautifully cut, and cost more than my mother made in a year of her whole life, and he did not take the jacket off. He smiled at me the way you smile at a nice piece of furniture you're about to make an offer on. He called me ma'am. He said what a treasure the house was, What good bones! What a shame what the neighborhood had been through, and every soft word out of his mouth was the July heat of 1968 coming back around polite as Sunday holding out a pen. I served the coffee. I served it in the good cups. And then I did the thing I do best in all the world, the thing 40 years of being looked past had trained me for like an athlete. I made myself into a chair, and I listened. They didn't even go to another room. That is how far gone their certainty was. They stood at my dining room window looking out at Delacroix Street, and they talked about me and around me and over me while I refilled the cream, and in 20 minutes I learned more than Beverly's people had pulled in a week. It was not one house. It was never one house. Grayson Pike had spent 3 years quietly buying up Millbrook, the corner store, the boarded houses, the lots, one shell company at a time, assembling the entire block, the way you'd assemble a straight in cards, holding your face still. He had all of it now. All of it but one stretch. 4 houses on Delacroix Street, and the woman who sat between him and a glass tower 40 stories high. The whole assemblage is contingent on the Coleman parcel, Pike said low to Vanessa, not even glancing at the old woman with the coffee pot. Without those 4 lots, there's no footprint. The financing doesn't pencil. It's the keystone. He said keystone the way a man says a word he said in a lot of meetings. How solid is the timeline? 60 days to the hearing, Vanessa said. Once the court appoints me, I sign as her conservator. It's clean. She won't even understand what's happening. She lowered her voice, but not enough they never lower it enough for a chair, and she said the number. Her cut. 7 figures for delivering the last old woman on the block. And she'd already signed something to prove she could a letter of intent, her name on it, promising a property she did not own to a man who could not have it. Miss Ruth Ann at 1412 is 88 years old. She has a garden of collards and a grandson's picture in every window. 2 doors down is the mail carrier who's raised 3 kids in that house on the rent I set. And this man in the blue suit meant to run a bulldozer through every one of them and put up a tower where the only people who could afford to live would be the kind of people who put down blue flags, and my own son's wife was going to hand him the key by way of a courthouse and a lie about my mind. I felt the old thing rise up in me then. Not rage, I gave up rage a long time ago. It's expensive and it's loud and it tells your enemy exactly where you are. What rose up in me was colder and older, and a great deal more useful. It felt God help me almost like joy, because a smiling man in a good suit had walked into my house holding a pen exactly the way one had walked into my mother's yard, and he had made exactly one mistake that the man in 1968 never made. He had done it in front of me. "More coffee, Mr. Pike," I said, and he held up his cup without looking at me, and I filled it. And I smiled down at the top of his expensive head. Darius came by that evening after they'd gone, alone, which was rare now. He stood in my kitchen doorway a long time with his hands in his pockets, my grown son, 41 years old, looking about 9. He watched me wash the good cups, and I could see him working up to something I know all my sons' faces, and this was the face of a boy who has done a thing he can't undo and hasn't found the courage to say so. "Mama," he said finally, "you know I'd never let anybody hurt you. Right, whatever happens, you know that." I dried a cup and set it in the rack. I did not turn around because I did not trust my own face just then, and because a person confessing needs room, and I wasn't ready to give him what he was fishing for. "I know you love me, baby," I said. Which was true and was not the same thing, and we both heard the difference, and he stood there in it for a moment and then said good night and left. I stood at my sink a long while after his car pulled away. Whatever they had gotten him to sign, and I did not yet know what, though I would, and it would be the one that hurt, I understood already that my son was not the villain of this. He was a man being crushed inside a thing too big for him, the way a good man can be. That did not excuse it, but it meant that when the day came I would have to build a door he could walk back through. The others I meant to close every door on at once, but not that one. A mother keeps one door. I dried the last cup and I hung up my apron and I went to the phone. Beverly, I said. It's bigger than the houses. He's got the whole block. Our 4 lots are the only thing standing between that man and 40 stories, and they know it, and they've got 60 days. I looked out my dark window at the blue signs glowing faintly under the streetlight planted in yards that used to be families. Start pulling everything, every name behind every one of Pike's shells. And Beverly, I said, get the box from Walter. It's time. Annie, she said carefully, once we move, they'll know you saw it coming. I thought about my mother in her yard holding a pen she couldn't read, trusting a man because trusting was cheaper. And I thought about how long I had waited and how quiet I had kept and how very tired I was of being a chair. Good, I said. Let them. Here is what I have learned about winning after a lifetime of watching people lose. The ones who lose are always the loudest. They celebrate before the whistle. They spend the money before it clears. And while they are busy being sure a quiet person can get an enormous amount of work done. So for the next few weeks, there were 2 households getting ready for the same day, and they could not have looked more different. In theirs, there was a party going on that hadn't started yet. Vanessa put a deposit down on a boat 31 feet of it. I saw the paperwork later, money she did not have against money she had not yet stolen. She had a man come by to look at my house and quote her on paint, standing in my front room, running his hand along my mother's plaster and talking about opening this all up. She told Pike it was done but for the signing. She was so certain the future had already happened that she started living in it. And certainty like that makes a person careless, and careless people leave a trail you could follow in the dark. In mine, there was no noise at all. Beverly came to my kitchen after dark, the way Simone had, and we worked at the table under the low light, like 2 women quilting. Walter brought the box the real records, the ones no county computer has ever seen, and we laid it all out, and we built. We pulled the name behind every shell company Grace and Pike had used to eat my neighborhood, and we wrote them all down on 1 page, and it made an ugly little family tree with his face at the top. We got Dr. Reese's report the moment it was filed, and I read it beside my own memory of that 11-minute room, and I marked every test he swore he'd given me, that he had not the clock. He never drew the pencil, that was never in the room, each lie, a little hook I could hang him on later. And I went walking. I put on my church shoes, and I went house to house down Delacroix and around the block, and I sat in kitchens. I have sat in for 30 years, and I told my neighbors the truth. Miss Ruth Ann at 1412 cried and then got angry, which is the correct order. The mail carrier signed his name to a statement about the woman who'd kept his rent where a mail carrier could pay it. One by one, quiet as prayer, my whole street put their names on paper for me. The same paper a gray suit had once used against my mother turned now the other way. There is a justice in that I don't have a better word for than sweet. I was building a case the way I build everything. Patiently. Completely. Twice. And then 4 days before the hearing, Beverly slid a folder across my kitchen table and said, "Annie, before you open this, I need you to sit down." I was already sitting down. That is how she told me it was bad. It was the family's filings. Everything Vanessa's lawyer had submitted to the court to support the petition, the declarations, the sworn statements from interested parties attesting to my decline. I read Vanessa's first. It was a performance, and I'd expected it, and it slid off me like rain. Then I turned the page, and there was my son's name, not typed, signed. In his own hand, the same hand I taught to hold a pencil at that very table, the same clumsy loop he's put on the tail of the D since he was 6 years old, and prouder of that letter than any child has ever been of anything. My Darius. And above his name in numbered paragraphs, a sworn declaration. I made myself read every word. I read everything twice. I did not spare myself this. He had reached into the deepest, most private rooms of my grief, my Samuel, who I do still talk to some evenings because 42 years does not stop the day the heart does, and he had turned it into evidence. He had signed his name to the lie that I am gone. I have been hit hard in my life. I told you about a yard in 1968. That was the first time the floor left me. This was worse. I sat at my own table with my son's signature under my hands, and I felt something in my chest that I do not have a good name for something below rage and below grief. In the cold place where those two things are the same thing, I did not cry. I want you to know that. Not because I am strong, everybody keeps telling me I'm strong and I am so tired of the word, but because I had one more thing to do, and tears are a kind of stopping, and I could not afford to stop yet. I closed the folder. I set my two hands flat on top of it, and I said to Beverly in a voice I kept level by an act of will I hope you never need to learn, all right. Just that. All right. The way you say it when the floor is gone and you have decided anyway to keep standing on the air. It was Simone who gave me the rest of it. She came the next night, and she was crying before she got in the door because she'd found what her father had been hiding and she couldn't carry it by herself any more than I could. "Grandma, it's not what it looks like," she said. "I found his stuff, his actual stuff. Please just look." She'd printed it the way she'd printed the first pages, a girl waging a whole war with a home printer and a brave heart. And it laid the last piece down for me, and it turned the knife into something I could finally use. The debt was Vanessa's, years of it, a business that never was cards, and a second mortgage and a loan against the management company run up in the dark, and one signature at a time, put in Darius's name some of it. Simone was sure with his hand guided, and some of it maybe without his hand at all. She had buried my son under a mountain of money he never spent, and then she had stood on top of the mountain and made him an offer. "Sign the declaration against your mother, or I let all of it come down." Bankruptcy, ruin. The company gone, the house gone, and she knew exactly where the soft place was. Simone's tuition gone. The girl pulled out of school in her second year with nothing. Sign or I take your daughter's future down with mine. And there was one thing more, and it was the thing that let me keep my promise about the door. He hadn't just signed and slunk off. In a folder inside a folder, my son had been quietly keeping copies. The real financials. Vanessa's real emails. A record of every forged line and every threat kept in the dark by a man too crushed to fight and too decent to destroy it. A drowning man holding one match dry against his chest, waiting, praying for somebody to come who could light it. He had signed the lie with one hand, and with the other he had saved me the evidence to burn it down. "He didn't know how to tell you," Simone whispered. "He said you'd never look at him again. He said he'd rather you thought he was weak than know what Grandma, he's been sick over it. He's been sick." I thought about my son standing in my kitchen doorway looking 9 years old. "You know I'd never let anybody hurt you." Right, I thought about how I hadn't turned around. And I understood finally the whole shape of it, that there had been a confession in that doorway I wasn't ready to hear, and a plea, and that my boy had been trying in the only broken way he had left to hand me the match himself. I gathered up Simone's pages and squared their edges. I put them in the folder with Beverly's, and I set my mother's people's signatures beside them, and I sat there a moment with all of it stacked under my two hands, the whole terrible, beautiful weight of it. My family's shame and my family's salvation in the same pile the way they so often are. 3 days until the hearing. "Beverly," I said into the phone, and my voice was steady now all the way through because the cold, clear thing had come back, and I had a use for it at last. "I know how we do it, not before the judge rules, after they think they've won. I want every word of theirs on the record first." I looked at the frame on my wall, the soft old paper under glass. "And I want you to file one thing for me quiet tonight, under the name I don't use." She was silent a moment. Then softly, "Annie." "Once we put that name in front of a judge, there's no more chair. Everyone in that room is going to see you." Outside my window, the blue signs glowed, planted in the yards of families who did not yet know they'd been saved. "Beverly," I said, "I have been waiting 58 years for somebody in a courtroom to see me. Let them look." I wore gray to the courthouse. A plain gray dress and my falling down shoes and my hair set soft, and I carried an old woman's pocketbook and let a bailiff take my arm on the courthouse steps. One last morning as the chair. I wanted them all the way up on the high dive before I turned off the water. Courtroom 4B. Vanessa at the petitioner's table in a suit she'd bought on my money before it was hers, her lawyer beside her, slick and bored. Grayson Pike in the third row because a man like that likes to watch his closings. Darius at the end of a bench with his head down. And Simone behind me close as she could get one hand on my shoulder the whole time like she was keeping me from floating off. And it began the way these things begin, with a nice man in a good suit holding papers being polite. Vanessa's lawyer stood and painted me. He read Dr. Reese's report into the record, all 3 pages of the examination that never happened. He played the little recording Vanessa had made in my own kitchen, my voice saying now, which Thursday baby stripped of everything that made it a performance, sounding for all the world like exactly what they said I was. The judge, a tired woman named Okafor with reading glasses pushed up in her hair, listened and made her notes, and I watched the belief settle onto her face, and I did not blame her one bit. They had built it well. Not as well as they thought, but well. Then he read my son's declaration out loud in open court, and that was the part I had to hold still for. As her son, she speaks of my late father as though he were still living. She can no longer safely manage her own affairs. My grief read aloud by a stranger, my Samuel's death turned into a symptom, my boy's name at the bottom. I sat with my 2 hands folded on my mother's framed deed in my lap. I'd carried it in my pocketbook. The soft old paper under glass. The only thing I brought, and I pressed my thumb against the frame, and I kept my face exactly still. Behind me, I heard Simone's breath catch. On the bench, Darius put his face in his hands. Your Honor, Vanessa's lawyer said the petition is unopposed by any qualified party. We'd asked the court to appoint Mrs. Coleman conservator without further. There is a qualified party. My voice. Not loud, but a courtroom is built to carry a quiet voice, and mine went all the way to the back wall. Judge Okafor looked over her glasses. Mrs. Coleman, you have counsel. I do, Your Honor. I set my pocketbook aside. She's been my counsel for 30 years. And Beverly Cross stood up from the gallery, my little friend from second service in a charcoal suit, now 30 years of trust work in the set of her shoulders, and walked through the gate to the empty table that was supposed to stay empty and set down a banker's box and said, Beverly Cross, Your Honor, for the respondent. We're prepared to be heard. I stood up then myself. And I want to tell you it was the strangest thing I felt every one of my 66 years leave my spine. I stood up straight for the first time in that whole room, and I looked at Vanessa, and I said the truest words I own. I didn't lose my memory, I told her. I just never forgot. Then I laid it down. All of it. The way you deal cards when you've had the winning hand the whole time and you finally get to turn them over slow. Your Honor, my name is Annie Ruth Coleman, and with respect to this court, I am not the confused old woman that report describes. I am a licensed real estate broker and a licensed fiduciary in this state, have been since 1981, one of the first women who looked like me to hold both. I didn't advertise it. In my experience, a woman gets more done when the room has decided she's harmless. I let that sit. This room decided that 11 weeks ago. I'd like to show you what I did with the time. I started with the doctor because it was the smallest lie and the easiest to break. Dr. Reese's report states he administered a clock drawing test. He describes my results in the 3rd paragraph. I looked at the judge. Your Honor, there was no pencil in that room. There was no paper. I was there 11 minutes, and he never once handed me either. I remember because I remember everything that is rather the point. Ms. Cross has the appointment logs and Dr. Reese's own equipment records, and I'd invite the court to ask him under oath which test he gave a woman he never handed a pencil. The judge's pen had stopped moving. Ms. Cross will also show the court. I went on the trail of companies Mr. Grayson Pike, who is sitting in your gallery, used to buy this neighborhood in the dark. And the letter of intent my daughter-in-law signed with him, promising a man 40 stories where my neighbors' houses are in exchange for a fee. I heard her name in my own dining room. And she'll show you where the debt in my son's name really came from, and what my daughter-in-law threatened to do to my granddaughter's future if he didn't sign that declaration against me. I did not look at Darius. I did it for him. My son kept every document that proves it. He kept them for a year. Ms. Cross has those too, provided this morning by an interested party. Across the room, Darius lifted his head. But none of that, I said, is the reason this petition was dead before it was ever filed. And I'd like Ms. Cross to explain the last part, because it's the part they never bothered to read. Beverly opened the box. The petitioner seeks control of the respondent's assets, she said, chiefly the 4 properties on Delacroix Street held by Coleman Legacy Holdings. There is one problem. Coleman Legacy Holdings does not own those properties and has not owned them since 2006. She laid the document on the judge's bench. 20 years ago, my client placed every one of those lots into an irrevocable community land trust, the Ida Mae Coleman Trust, named for her mother. The land is held in perpetuity for the residents of Millbrook. It cannot be sold out from under them. It cannot be borrowed against. It is not part of Mrs. Coleman's personal estate, and no conservator of her person, not the petitioner, not anyone can reach it. If this court declared my client incompetent this afternoon, the petitioner would gain control of a management company that manages property it does not own. She would win an empty box. Beverly almost smiled. With a bow on it. The courtroom was very, very quiet. I picked my mother's frame back up off the table, and I held it against my chest. That soft old paper a gray suit took in a yard in 1968 because nobody in my family could read it. They came to take my land the same way a man once took my mother's, I said, with a smile and a pen and a piece of paper betting I couldn't read it. I looked at Vanessa at Pike at the whole polite machine of it. I spent 40 years learning to read every word they've got, and then I learned to write them. You should have asked before you decided I was gone who exactly had been keeping all of this straight. Judge Okafor took off her reading glasses. She looked at Vanessa's lawyer, who had nothing, and at Pike, who was already reaching for his coat, and then at me, standing straight in my plain gray dress, holding a framed deed like a shield. "Mrs. Coleman," she said, "I don't believe I've ever seen anyone less in need of a conservator in my life. I did not want blood. I have never wanted blood. Blood is loud, and it brings its own weather, and it has a way of raining back on the people you were trying to protect. What I wanted was for it to be over cleanly with the right things landing on the right people. So the week after the hearing, I sat down and I decided each of them the way you decide a will. Grayson Pike got the truth of the law which he had never once expected to meet. His deal was void. You cannot buy what a trust holds in perpetuity, and he'd known the whole assemblage rested on a keystone he could never actually lift. Everything Beverly pulled on his shell companies and the forged evaluation his money had helped put in front of a judge went to the district attorney in one thick envelope. A man who takes a neighborhood in the dark counts on nobody ever turning on the light. I turned it on. What the courts do with him now is their business. The daylight was mine to give. Vanessa I gave a choice because I am my mother's daughter, and she raised me to leave a person one honest door. I sat across from her one last time and I said, "You can walk out of this family quietly. Return what you took, sign the divorce, and never touch my son or my granddaughter again. Or you can let the district attorney read everything I have. The forged debt, the threats, the letter to Pike." She looked at me with those hard, frightened eyes, and I saw underneath the woman who'd tried to bury me, the girl who'd grown up with nothing and swore nothing would ever be able to happen to her again. I knew that girl. I was a version of that girl in a yard in 1968. "I know what it is to be that afraid of ending up with nothing," I told her. "I do. But you and I did two different things with it. I stood up. I chose to build. You chose to take. That's the whole difference between us, and it's the only one that ever mattered. She left the next morning. She did not say goodbye, and I did not need her to. And then there was my son. Darius came to my house, and he could not get a whole sentence out. He stood in that same kitchen doorway, and he shook, 41 years old, and he said, "Mama, I signed it. I put my name on it. I don't know how you can even look at me." I held the one door open the way I'd promised myself I would. "You signed the lie with one hand," I said, "and you saved me every piece of paper to burn it with the other. I know which hand was really you." I took his face in both of mine the way I'd taken Simone's. "I'm not going to pretend you didn't cut me. You did, but you're going to earn your way back across it, and I'm going to let you because that's what the door is for." He learned the business after that, really learned it for the first time sitting at Beverly's elbow, and he started with Simone from nothing, one honest supper at a time. Some doors you don't get to walk back through easy, but you get to walk back through. Miss Ruth Ann still has her collards. The mail carrier still pays the rent I set. The blue signs came up out of the yards one by one, and the block stayed exactly, stubbornly, gloriously itself. A few weeks later, I put Simone and Darius in my car, and I drove them 3 hours out down roads that got redder and narrower the whole way to a place I had never once brought them. 40 acres of red Georgia dirt, a creek, and a stand of old pecan trees. My mother's land. I'd been buying it back for 11 years. Quietly, the way I do everything, a parcel here, a strip there, from the grandchildren of the man in the gray suit who had no idea what it was and were happy to take my checks. I'd closed on the last of it the month before, and I'd just finished signing it every red acre into the Ida Mae Coleman Trust so that it could never ever be taken from my family again. I got out of the car, and I walked into the middle of that field, and I knelt down and I put my hand flat against the dirt. And I cried. I want you to understand I had not cried this whole time. Not at the letter, not at my son's signature, not in that courtroom. I had held it every step because tears are a kind of stopping, and I could not afford to stop. But there was nothing left to hold now. It came up out of me like water out of a well that's been capped for 58 years, and I let it kneeling in my mother's dirt with my hand pressed to the ground like I could reach her through it. Simone knelt down beside me and put her arm around me, and Darius stood over us both with his hand on my shoulder, and I told them. About Ida Mae. About the July heat, and the gray suit, and the pen, and an 8-year-old girl standing in this exact field, watching the strongest woman she ever knew lose everything to a piece of paper she couldn't read. Then I took my mother's framed deed out of my bag, the soft old paper under glass, and I put it in Simone's hands. I didn't hide what I was to get even with anybody, I told her. I hid it so I could do this, so I could put it back. And so one day I could hand it to you, a girl in this family who is never, not once in her whole life, going to have to be afraid of a piece of paper. You read everything, baby. You hear me twice. And then you learn to write them. She was crying too by then, holding that frame against her chest exactly the way I had. 3 of us in a green field that used to be ours and was ours again, standing on ground my mother lost, and I bought back 1 pecan tree at a time. That's the day I finally set the whole thing down, right there in the dirt, and it was lighter than I'd carried it for. So, you asked me at the start to stay with the story till the end, and you did, and I thank you for it. People are going to hear how this came out and call me lucky. I told you they would. But I want you to hear me one more time, because it's the only thing in this whole story I really need you to keep. I was never lucky. I was a little black woman in a neighborhood the world had written off at the head of a table where they talked right over me in a courtroom where they'd already decided I was gone. They looked straight past me for years, the banks, the lawyers, the men in good suits, my own family at the end. They spent all those years looking past me. I used that time well. So the next time you see some old woman on a porch, the one nobody asks a question of, the one they've already counted out, the one holding nothing but a cup of tea and a quiet face, you be careful how you look at her. You have no idea what she's holding. You have no idea what she has already done.